Okay, so in this lecture we're going to go over tracts. And so what tracts are, the definition of them is they are bundles of myelinated axons within the central nervous system. So the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. So what I'm going to discuss in this lecture are some of the specific types of tracts, what it is that they actually do, as in the information that they carry to the brain and then also away from the brain. But before I get into the details of the pathways and everything, the first thing we need to go over is some of the anatomy for the spinal cord. Okay, so I have my spinal cord model here. And once again, the first thing that I always do is I orient myself. I figure out what it is that I am looking at. Am I looking at the front? Am I looking at the back? And so on. And so in order to orient myself, the first thing I do is I look for this structure. So this structure is known as the dorsal root ganglion. So if I look at this, I know that this is in the back, and then the other side is what's in the front. Okay, so let's identify some of the basics, and then we'll get more specific. Okay, so this here is the spinal cord. It's within the central nervous system. Everything that's out here, this is part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so this is the white matter on the outside, and then the gray matter is here on the inside. So then let's identify some of the basic structures here. So we're using directional terms in order to describe things. Okay, so this is a column, this is a column, this is a column here. There are three columns. So these are the dorsal columns, these are the lateral columns, and these are the ventral columns. So then within the gray matter, we use horns, okay, because it's just kind of like describing what it looks like. But then we also use directional terms. So you have the dorsal horns, the lateral horns, and the ventral horns. Okay, so that's some of the stuff here on the inside. But then if we go to the outside, there's a couple different terms. So it's rami, roots, and rootlets. So this is a rami, this is, rami, this is a root, and these are the rootlets. So these are the guys that they like to have fun. Yeah, rootlets. So make sure that you don't forget that. Okay, so now we're going to use some of the specific terms to describe this. So this is the ventral rami, this is the dorsal rami coming off the back side, this is the spinal nerve, and then this is, so I said the rami, so then this is the ventral root, and then this is the dorsal root. This is the DRG, the dorsal root ganglion. So then what's here, so this is the ventral rootlets, and then these are the dorsal rootlets. Okay, so some of the other structures that are found here within the white matter. So you have the median, the dorsal median sulcus, the dorsal intermediate sulcus, which is splitting the dorsal columns. And then you have the white commissure, which is here, number 4. Number 8 is the gray commissure, and then number 9 is the central canal. This is where cerebrospinal fluid circulates. Okay, so now we've identified some of the basics. Now we're going to identify some of the specific tracts and their locations. But before I do this, I want to give you just some of the basics of tracts. So there are two main types of tracts. You have ascending and descending tracts. So if it's ascending, that means it's going to the brain. If it's descending, that means it's going away from the brain. So based off of what I just told you, so if it's going to the brain, we're transmitting sensory information to the brain so we can process that. And if it's coming down from the brain and out, we're transmitting motor information for movement. Okay, so we're going to discuss the three main tracts and some of their subparts. Okay, so let's identify them on this. So on the back side, I've already identified the dorsal columns. So the one that's here, that's lateral. This is the fasciculus cuneatus. So you have the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. So for the cuneatus, it's transmitting information for the upper extremity. For here, it's for the lower extremity. So these are ascending tracts. So then two of the other ascending tracts, the primary information that's transmitted is for pain and temperature. So these are what we know as the ventral and lateral spinothalamic tracts. So let's identify them. So this one is what would be the lateral spinothalamic, and this 34 is what would be the ventral spinothalamic. So then if we look at over here, both of these are the corticospinal. So this is the lateral corticospinal, which is 35, and then 36 is the ventral corticospinal. Okay, so I'm going to put this down. And so one thing that you'll notice for the tracts is that the name of the tract describes the direction that it's going. So when I say corticospinal, it's going from the cerebral cortex down through the spinal cord. When I say spinothalamic, it's going from the spinal cord to the thalamus, which is within the brain. Okay, so now we have a good understanding of like some of the basic anatomy and some of the basics of the ascending and descending tracts. I'm going to work my way towards the board, and we'll talk about some of the specifics. Okay, so I've already mentioned ascending and descending tracts, but the next thing is, well, where does this information go? Where does this information from the tracts go to? So this is something that we discussed last week, and we've identified some of the functional regions of the brain. So now we're trying to connect the dots. So if we look at the colored brain model, once again, just to remind you, so this is the precentral gyri, and this is the postcentral gyri. So the function for the precentral gyri is the primary motor cortex. For this one, it's the primary somatosensory cortex. So once again, so motor information is coming from here. It starts here and then it goes its way down. And then sensory information is coming from the peripheral, and it's synapsing here so we can interpret that sensation. So, well, where does this information come from? So there are two main sites where the information is coming, the sensory information is coming from. So that's why I have this skin model here. So within the skin model, in the future, we'll identify some of these specific structures. So for instance, this one here, and all of these. So what they're functioning as, they're known as mechanoreceptors, meaning that they need a certain stimulus in order to initiate the propagation of this action potential to get it to the brain. Okay, so it's from the skin, and sensory information is also coming from the muscles. Okay, so within the muscles, there are two main types of receptors that you have. So within the tendons, you have what's known as the Golgi tendon organs, and then you also have within the muscle spindles, so within the muscle fibers themselves, there are also some mechanoreceptors that are found there. Okay, so, and the reason they become activated once the muscle starts to stretch. So the information that we're interpreting from the muscles is what we know as proprioception. So let me define to you what proprioception actually is. So the example that I like to give with proprioception, and so think about it. So if someone is playing baseball, okay, well, they have to put their glove out in front to field the ground ball. But whenever they're trying to field the ground ball, they're not looking at their glove, right? They're looking at the ball that's coming towards them. So they have to know, right, the position of where their hand is in space in order to, right, to field the ground ball and then to make a throw. So that's using proprioception, which is understanding the position of our limbs in space. Okay. So I've discussed where it starts, so skin and the muscle, where it ends within the primary somatosensory cortex, and then the functions. So one is proprioception, the next is sensation, so detecting things. So we'll start to learn the specifics of which mechanoreceptors are going to detect or send specific types of information, but the sensation of what I'm describing So you have touch, pressure and vibration, and pain and temperature. We'll get into the details as far as like fine versus crude touch, but I just want you to know which spinal nerves are which tracts are transmitting the information. Okay, so we are good on ascending tracts, some of the basics here, and then the descending tracts, I've already discussed this, right? It's starting at the precentral gyri, right, primary motor cortex, and the target is the neuromuscular junction, which is what we have already covered, right? We're trying to release the neurotransmitter so the action potential can go, and we can then get our muscle contractions. And the function of these tracts, what they're helping to do is for voluntary muscle control. And so I've already mentioned we'll get into the specifics here in a little bit. But before I discuss like the details of the dorsal columns and then the spinothalamic tract, I have a couple questions for you. So the first question that I have is, how do neurons synapse? And so I have two multipolar neurons that are synapsing together. And so the way that they synapse is basically head to tail. So let me describe what I mean by that. So this is the cell body, these are the dendrites coming off, this is the axon, and then these are the axon terminals. So the axon terminal will typically synapse with the dendrites of the next neuron, which is found where the cell body is. And so what I have drawn here, this is a blown up version of this neuron communicating with the next one, which is what we have already discussed. So we've discussed that neurotransmitters are traveling within these vesicles, they get released, and then we initiate an action potential going to the next. So this is the presynaptic, that's the postsynaptic neuron. So we've already learned that. So what we're going to learn is, because there are multiple neurons that you're traveling through this pathway. It's not just one single long neuron that's from the top to the bottom. We have to transmit the signal through different neurons, okay? But we have to have a good understanding of how it is that one neuron communicates with the next for this like series of connections. Okay, so the names of these connections are different based off of whether it's ascending or a descending tract. So for ascending tracts, you have first, second, and third order neuron. All that means is that you have the first one, you have the second one, and then you have the third one. That's all that means. And then for the descending tracts, you have upper motor neurons, meaning that they start at the top, and then you have lower motor neurons, which are found within the spinal cord. Okay. So now we have a good understanding of that. The next question is, where do neurons synapse? And the answer to that question is that it depends on the tract, on the specific type of tract, where they are synapsing with each other. So the first example that we have is the dorsal columns. Okay, we've already described the fasciculus cuneatus, the fasciculus gracilis. And so the information that's transmitted by fasciculus cuneatus, I've already said this, it's the upper extremity. For the gracilis, it's transmitting information for the lower extremity. And some of the specific types of information that it's transmitting, so for the dorsal columns, we have, I'm going to label this as number 1. So 1 is proprioception. It also communicates 2, which is fine touch. And it also communicates pressure and vibration. So I'm going to put all of these as number 1, actually. So number 1, and number 1. So when we activate the dorsal columns, this is the information that we are transmitting to the brain. And depending on whether it's in the upper extremity, so for instance, like the arm, right, the trunk, that's upper extremity compared to the lower extremities on the bottom. That's what they're going to travel through, okay? Okay, so now that we understand that, the next thing is going through first, second, and third order neurons. So this one here in blue, this is the first order. The one here in black, this is the second order. And the one here in green, this is my third order neuron. And then the final neuron that we get to is found within the cerebral cortex. So the name of the neuron in the cerebral cortex is what's known as the pyramids, or the pyramidal neurons. So this is where we're trying to get to. Okay, this is where we need to, the last spot. Okay, so the next thing is for the skin and the muscle, this is the first part, right? I've already discussed this, so let me write this out on the board. I've already mentioned that. So with muscles, you have mechanoreceptors, which are found within the muscle fibers. And then you also have within what's known as the Golgi tendon organs. This is within, obviously, tendons, okay? And how we activate these receptors is by stretch of the muscle. Okay, so for the skin, we have our mechanoreceptors, and these mechanoreceptors, right, this is the information that they're transmitting, what we know as sensation. Okay. So for the dorsal columns, let's say we activate the skin neuron, or the skin model, right? So like touching this. So then the information will travel up the nerves, right, depending on which region I'm touching. So it'll travel up through the peripheral nerves, which is what you identified on the arm models. And then it'll eventually get to where the spinal cord is. But in order to get to the spinal cord, the first spot, the action potential, is traveling along this way. And then we already know where the cell body location is for the first order neuron. So it's within the dorsal root ganglion, remember, because this is a unipolar neuron. So then from there, the axon will continue, and then it travels up the spinal cord until it gets to the medulla. The medulla is a region within the brainstem. So then from the medulla, right, there's a synapse here, right, because that's the question that we're answering. Where do neurons synapse? So there's one synapse here within the medulla for this first and second order. And then from the second to the third, the next synapse is found here within the thalamus. So there's a synapse that occurs there. So then from the thalamus, it then travels to the brain through a region known as the internal capsule. And then we finally reach our final synapse here at the cerebral cortex, where the pyramidal neurons are found. So we can now interpret the information that was sent over here. Okay, so that's for the dorsal columns. So the next tract we're going to discuss is the spinothalamic tract. And so the spinothalamic tract, obviously the information is different that it's transmitting, because it's primarily, so what the lateral spinothalamic tract, the information is mainly pain and temperature. So when you think of spinothalamic, this is the first thing that I want you to think of. And then some of the other ones for the ventral, so you have crew touch. You also have vibration, or actually pressure. So crew touch. Yeah, crew touch and pressure. Those are the main ones for the ventral spinothalamic. Okay, so now the synapse for the spinothalamic tract, it's very similar, okay? So you have the DRG, and then it gets to the cerebral cortex. There's also a synapse here in the thalamus. But the difference is when the first and the second order neurons, they're going to synapse right away within the spinal cord. So where they synapse is within the dorsal horn, so that's within the gray matter. So once they get synapse with the dorsal horns, they then cross over, go up the spinal cord until they get to the thalamus, where the third order neuron is found. Okay, so once again, this is a small schematic here. What I have drawn over here, we're going to follow the actual pathway up to the brain and then down the brain. But we have to know this first before we start to go over like where they cross over and stuff. So that's the final question that we're going to answer. Where do axons cross over, or where do they decussate? Okay, so the last tract is a descending tract, which is what's known as the corticospinal tract. So you have the ventral and the lateral corticospinal tract. The ventral one transmits information for the proximal muscles. The lateral corticospinal transmit information for the distal muscles. So when I say distal, I mean like the hands, the fingers, right, like the forearms, some of those muscles, compared to the proximal ones, which would be more towards this way, right, the upper arm and then the trunk area, okay? Right, distal also would be like the toes and everything like that. Okay, so corticospinal tracts, and then remember, once again, the names are different. So you have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. The upper motor neuron, it starts within the pyramidal neurons, and then the lower motor neuron, where this is found, it's found within the ventral horn, which is within the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then we finally get to our terminal end, right? The axons will continue out, go through the peripheral nerves, and then we get to the neuromuscular junction. But typically what's found between them is an interneuron within the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay. All right, so now we're done with this. Next we're going to follow the route. So where do axons cross over? So I'm going to come over here. So once again, we are divided into ascending versus the descending tracts. Okay, but before I get into the pathway, the first thing we have to know is what it is that we are looking at. So this is a coronal section or a frontal section of the brain. So this means that you're looking at, we cut off the anterior part and you're looking at like the posterior part of it. And then what this represents here, both of these, that's what's representing the medulla, right? Because that's what the second order neuron is found for here, and then this is a cross-section of the spinal cord. Okay, so we know what it is that we're looking at, and then the next thing is what we know as the homunculus. Okay, so the homunculus, this is it's within the cerebral cortex right here, so this outer part in blue, and then in red, the neurons are gonna, the axons are going to travel to specific regions in the brain, okay? So for instance, what's here that's more medial, here in the middle, this is transmitting information. So one, this is for the genitals, the lower extremity, and the trunk. So let's say we stimulate a nerve like in the foot, right? It's going to travel and finally get to this specific part where the final synapse is. And then if you work your way lateral, it then goes to the upper extremity. And then over here, this is where the face is. And it's the same thing for both of the sides as far as like the organization. But remember, this is the, for ascending tract, this is the postcentral gyrus, this is the precentral gyrus, where it's going to. Okay, so now we know what it is that we're looking at and everything. Let's follow these tracks. Okay, so the first one we're going to go over is the fasciculus cuneatus. So we're stimulating this neuron over here. I'm going to draw it this way so it doesn't. So it would be here, and then it goes within the ventral rami, and then it goes through the backside. So then the cell body is found here within the DRG. The axon goes up, continues, and then from here we're traveling through the dorsal columns, right? Specifically the fasciculus cuneatus, so that's what's found here. So the axon will go here, and then it goes up this way. So it goes up till it gets to the medulla, and then it's going to synapse here once again at the fasciculus cuneatus, or not the fasciculus cuneatus. So let me write this down real quick. So for the first order, the cell body is found within the DRG, the dorsal root ganglion, and then for the second order neuron, the cell body is found within the nucleus cuneatus. So if you remember the fundamentals, does anyone remember the definition of nuclei? So clusters of cell bodies within the central nervous system. So that's why we call it the nuclei, and then cuneatus is representing for the lower extremity, right? Because that's where it's going. So it'll synapse there with our second order neuron. And so once again, this is within the medulla. So then the third order neuron, so I'm going to draw it in black here. So first order, it synapses with the second order neuron, which is found here. And then once it reaches this point, that's when it crosses over. So it crosses over at this part right here. So there's two of them. But it'll cross over this way and then go up. So this point right here is what we know as, I have it drawn over here, so the medial lemniscal. That's why they call it the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, because this is the medial lemniscus, which is found here within the medulla. So nucleus, cuneatus, and then it crosses over at the medial lemniscus. Okay, so now let's continue following the second order neuron. So it goes here, goes down, it goes up until it reaches the thalamus. So at the thalamus is where the cell body of, I should have done that in green. Yeah, let's do that in green, make it clear. So here it goes up, synapse is here with the third order. So then the cell body of the third order neuron is found here. And then once again, we're transmitting information for the upper extremity. So for the upper extremity, that would be around this region over here. So it would synapse over there. Okay, so for the third order, we have within the thalamus, more specifically, the region is called the ventral posterolateral nucleus. Okay, so the next one is the lateral spinothalamic. So the first order neuron, once again, it's found in the DRG. The second order neuron is found within the dorsal horns, within the gray matter. So let's follow it from this side. So it goes in there this way, goes here, and then it'll synapse right here at the dorsal horn with the second order neuron. So then I'm going to draw it right there. So the second order neuron will decussate, and then it crosses over until it gets to where the lateral spinothalamic pathway is. So then it goes up this way. So we're bypassing the medulla, and then we'll finally synapse here with the third order neuron within the thalamus. So at the thalamus, this is where our ventral posterolateral nuclei is found. So which is the same thing as here, or nucleus, nucleus. So this is where the third order neuron is found. And then once again, for the lateral spinothalamic, depending on the region, it'll go up this way. So that would be, for instance, once again, like the upper extremity. Okay, so that's for ascending. The last one are the descending tracts. So for the lateral corticospinal, you have the upper motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron would be found here. And then it's going to go down, goes all the way down, and then it's going to travel, I'm going to draw it here so it's easier, through the internal capsule. And then once it reaches, so it goes down this way. So once it reaches at this point, this is the point known as the pyramids. So the pyramids are found within the medulla. And we should have identified that on the brainstem. But from there, that's when it crosses over. So it'll cross over, and then it goes down. And then it synapses with our lower motor neuron. Do it in black. So this is where the lower motor neuron is found, within the ventral horn. So that's what goes out this way through the ventral rootlets, the rami, or this is the root, and then this is the ventral rami, which will then go to its specific muscle. Okay, so I'm going to put this here. Okay. All right, so that's going to do it for this lecture. Are there any questions? Okay.